from the CyberHub bunker and studio. You're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast, Tech Corner. And now, join me in welcoming your host and CISO, James Azar.
Happy Friday, boys and girls, women and men, ladies of the free world. It's the weekend before Election Day in America, so I've decided for this week's Tech Corner, I'm going to go across the pond where there's no such thing as elections, to one of my favorite countries on the planet, the Netherlands, where flowers are ampleful, French fries is a national food, and so much more. Jelle, welcome to the show.
Hi there. Yeah, French fries is a thing with us. Also,
it is.
Dead fish. We eat a lot of herring.
Yeah, but I see that like all over Europe, especially like in the northern eastern bloc. Like I remember my first time in Kiev. I had just landed in Kiev, and I was I dropped from the apartment we were staying in to go to get some, water and food from the supermarket across the street. And this drunk Ukrainian lady was carrying a bottle of vodka and a dried dead fish. And that was her idea of a good time. I was like, wow, I've made it in life.
Yeah. Well, welcome to Europe then, eh? That's typical over here.
That's typical in Northern Europe. Like, you'll never see an Italian, like, with an espresso and a dead fish, a dried dead fish.
No, that's definitely, look, don't combine dead fish and coffee anyway. Coffee's too good for that. But we have some strange habits over here. Licorice, eating dead fish, so herring, which is been fermenting in its own bile. But hey, let's not go into that one too much.
We won't. So, folks, before we get into today's episode and the whole purpose of it, make sure you subscribe right now. If you're watching us on YouTube, hit the subscribe, turn on the bell button, get your notification. I'm very close to monetizing this channel. Come on, folks. We're like 40 subscribers away. So please subscribe, share this, get your friends to subscribe. We're so close. So close. You can get all of our content at cyberhubpodcast.com, including all of this week's practitioner briefs and our CISO talk this week, which we aired yesterday with the magnificent George Feeney and his new book, The 9 Habits in Cybersecurity. And it was a very, very fun conversation. His book is now available on Amazon. You can get it there. He's the CISO over at SMU. And I've done doing all the promotion. My buddy Jelle, first time we met was this year at RSA.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, when people were, we hugged, and people looked at us weird. They were like, and you're so much taller than me. I felt like I was, hugging a giant NBA player. Like, Dutch people and, like, length. I think, like, you guys are stretched out. Like, I think when you're born, the doctors, here in America, like, they put the baby on the mom's stomach, and then other than they're like, wait, stretch the baby. Okay, he'll be over 6 feet tall now.
Yeah, that's about the average of Dutch people. We're tall. Can't help it. Genes, whatever. It's just the way it is. We're tall.
It is. So, yeah. I'm surprised there's not that many Dutch players in the NBA.
Actually, no, I think there's one or something. That's
right, but y'all are like a tall with long arms, like... and athletically fit. Like, I go to the Netherlands, like, everyone's just so good looking and fit. I'm like, wow. And they eat French fries. Like,
look, our export product just isn't people. We do tulips. That's what we do, right? Flowers. That's what we export. So, and the basketball, it isn't a big thing over here. It's soccer, not even football, soccer and tennis. Those are big sports over here. So. No, I'm afraid you won't be seeing many Dutch basketball players in the US.
It was funny to watch the World Cup a few years ago when the Netherlands I think they were playing like South Korea, and they had like a 6-inch height advantage over like the tallest player on the other team, and it was funny to watch how many times they would just volley the ball over the other players. Like, it wasn't soccer at some point. It was just like, hey, let's head the ball. They'll never get it.
We still lost, right? Probably.
No. I mean, I realize, soccer is a very, very big thing. And I grew up, when I lived in Israel as a child, I remember cheering for Ajax, right? Like, every Jewish kid cheers for Ajax. Ajax was like the team. It's been a blast. All right, so we won't go into any more of these stories. Let's get right into kind of a little bit of cyber operations, US versus the EU, right? So people like to say there's a difference in cyber between nations. I like to say there really isn't. It's pretty much all the same. Agree or disagree with that statement? And don't you nish-nash on me. I see you going like,
no. Okay, so I disagree. I think there's there's huge differences. Like, it's cultural differences, it's differences in the way businesses are run, differences in management, differences in how laws and legislations are put together. No, there definitely are huge differences. And there's a plus side to that, because if everything was the same, we couldn't learn from each other. So right. I actually like the fact that, so I'm in the Netherlands, I work for KnowBe4 and responsible here in the EMEA area, and I visit the US a lot. And the cool thing about that is I get to see both worlds. And first off, Europe, there's not one Europe. There might be a European Union, which has laws and legislations that every nation state has to oblige to, but there isn't one country that's called Europe. It's 31 countries with 31 major differences. If you want to compare it to anything, you can compare it to the US states, right? There's legislation from above, and then every state can have its own legislation or add to that. Same with the European Union. The only difference between what you see in the US and you see in Europe is that in Europe we have a lot of boundaries. Think language, for instance. If you look at the Netherlands, everyone speaks Dutch and English. Same goes for Belgium, Germany. But if you go to the UK, everybody speaks English, but British English, but no Dutch, no Belgian, Flemish, no German. So we kind of sometimes have a hard time understanding each other here in the EU. And that goes, it's the same for laws and legislations. We might think of something, but then our neighboring country might think of something different, which doesn't really comply or align with what we do in a country, in the Netherlands, for instance. And in cyber, the biggest difficulty is that there's no fixed boundaries, right? Everything is digital. Boundaries don't exist. So it might be that a crime is committed in the Netherlands, but you're being prosecuted in Germany, but the laws are completely different there. And that's what we see in Europe. It's not one Europe. So I think that if you look at, yes, there's a big difference between the US and Europe, definitely, in the end.
Well, so you talked about some of the structural differences, and I agree with that. I mean, I know most people think of Americans as people who are not well-traveled, and most Americans don't have a passport. I'd like to point out that there's a globe right behind my head, and if you look at the tightest clusters of pins, that's the EU. I think I've traveled to 29 countries in the EU over the last decade, and wow. I was telling you before the show, I love the Netherlands. I don't like tourist Amsterdam. I like Amsterdam. When you get out of the three rings, when you start to go where people live, where you're riding your bike around, and you're visiting the small cafes that are, they don't have an English menu, right? Mm-hmm. Like that, it's all in Dutch. And those are the places when I travel that I like to visit. I don't like to do the tourist stuff. I've despised the tourist stuff. I like museums, right? So I like to visit museums and history and so forth, but I don't like to do like the tourist, like, let's go to a square and take a picture by a big sign that says Amsterdam. I'm like,
yeah,
just check it.
We have one of those.
I know.
I love Amsterdam. Yeah.
Yeah, there's that aspect. So I agree with you with some of those structural differences within the EU. We obviously see that, every nation deals with kind of a different different set of challenges from mentality, right? Italians are very different from Spaniards and the Greeks and the Dutch and, the Germans. Oh, the Germans, right? Or the French, and so forth. And so, I agree with you on that aspect. Like, totally agree with you on that. Like, it's indeed a challenge for many, right?
Yes. So if you look at, for instance, let's take compliance, right? Which is, in my opinion, the US is a couple of years ahead of Europe when it comes to compliance and how companies deal with that.
So let me stop you right there, because in the US, people look and they go, we need a GDPR type of bill.
Yeah, well, GDPR in certain aspects is based on what's already live in the US. There's a lot of
Hey, Jelle, we lost your audio there for just a moment. Could you repeat that last sentence?
Sure, we can. So, if you look at compliance, I think Europe is a couple of years behind.
Right.
So, if you look at organizations in the US that need to comply to specific laws and legislation, I think the willingness to do that is the mindset of those organizations is different than in Europe. In Europe, I think no organization likes to do compliance, right? That's bottom line. But the willingness to do so in the US comes from the fact that it's mandatory to do so, and in some way, the mindset is more ingrained in organization to just look. We need to actually comply to stuff, and we will do it in a way that actually makes sense. Whereas in Europe, most organizations over here, they don't want to comply to anything, and if they have to comply to something, they'll just see it as a tick in the box. And that's it. And I'm not talking about the large organizations, look, multinational, global organizations, all different ballpark. But if you look at SMB, a small medium enterprise, SME in the US, they tend to be a bit more rebel over here. They tend to compliance who needs it. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, what I see is that my experience in the US with organizations is that they look at cybersecurity from a threat perspective. They look at, okay, what kind of dangers are coming at my organization? What kind of threats do I need to counter? Whereas in Europe, most organizations come from a risk perspective.
So I'm going to correct you there. You obviously aren't listening to my CISO Talk podcast, because if you were, you'd know that we very much look at it from a risk perspective. And a lot of CISOs and a lot of organizations look at it from a risk perspective. Boards look at it from a risk perspective. I think, and you know what? I'm glad we're having this conversation because, we always look at so it's really funny to hear you say that. And I think a lot of our audience are chuckling right now. I really do. Because if they're US based, they go, we're constantly hearing about how great Europe does security, right? And how great Europe does policy enforcement and how quick Europe is to policy enforce. Like, think of GDPR and the first fines were within like 60 days of GDPR being enforced, right? Here in the US, they pass a law. It takes it 6 months just to go into effect, and then it takes it 3 years to get a fine, right? Because of the investigations and the different aspects that have to go into it. And so things here aren't resolved or handled as swiftly as they are in Europe. And it's so funny because when I talk to people about like the EU and cyber, they go, well, look at how advanced they are. They have GDPR, they have, data breach notification, the DPO, the offices of the DPOs, like, the country DPO. And in the US, we don't have that. And and to be quite honest, the U.S., I think, from a legislative perspective, saying this on the weekend before the election might, get me in trouble, but I don't really care. I had on last week on the CISO Talk podcast, I had on my good friend Patrick Gall. Patrick is the executive director for the NTSC, the National Technology Security Coalition, a group of CISOs on the Hill. And I was on the board for a little over a year and a half with Pat. I stepped back this year to give opportunities for others to step in. And Pat's an amazing guy, and his organization does awesome work. We've been pushing data breach notification law for 3 years. You know when the bill made it to the floor? 3 months ago. So think how slow that is.
I think that the funny thing is, if I speak to CISOs over here in Europe, they look at the US in the same way as apparently your US CISOs look at Europe. We really do feel that the US is ahead in some areas.
Well, I'll tell you where the US is getting better at, right? The US is getting better at quantifying risk. And I think when we talk about a risk-based approach to cyber, it's not just how much risk you're willing to take, it's how do you quantify that risk versus your spend. And that kind of takes into cyber operations and cyber business operations, which is how do you quantify if your system is down for 3 days? How do you quantify the risk if your system is down for 2 hours? If it's a critical, non-critical system, the cost of backups, the cost of running a blue-green environment, so forth.
What's your risk appetite, basically? So that's what that's something I've seen in Europe for a long time already. Risk appetite has been on the boardroom topic for a long time. Doesn't really mean that executives understand what it's all about, but at least they're talking about it and they're approaching risk appetite from a gut feeling. So quantifying it, that's even here in Europe, that's still something we need to do. We make it measurable, use metrics to quantify cybersecurity or cyber threats, both sides of the same coin, right? So I think that in terms of maturity, that's an area where Europe still needs to grow a lot.
Yeah.
So if you're doing that in US legislation, I get it. Any country getting a law passed or a law to be decided upon, or even getting a law to the floor, it takes a long time, especially if you look at in Europe, for instance. As I said, it's 31 different countries. So everybody needs to agree to pass a law before we actually can implement that law. That takes a long time. GDPR was a long time in the making. It's not something that was done in a year. Yes, right. Once we agreed, it was implemented rather quickly. What helped was that we already had a data privacy law before that. So it's a version 2.0, let's call it that. So everybody was already used to it for some parts. And yes, we did. There were some pretty hefty fines right off the bat. But I do feel that if you look at it now, if you look at the number of incidents that happen of companies where there were data breaches where GDPR was applicable, you don't see those too many anymore.
Well,
so it might be that in the beginning we were very strict about it. I don't know if we're still strict. I don't know if the EU is still.
So let me ask you this though. Sorry to cut you off, but you brought up a really good point, and I'm actually so I agree with you, because people have been saying like, look, GDPR worked, and I was like, did GDPR work, or did people stop complaining, or are the DPOs so overworked, right, that they don't know where to begin with dealing with the GDPR complaints that come in from the citizens and investigate it. There's a lot of aspects to the initial. I think like the initial warning shot of GDPR was, we're going to set the tone. So France went after Googly, Google. I like to call them Googly sometimes, and different countries went after different brands. Facebook, you name it. So many others, right?
Oh, they targeted the big ones,
right? And that's what it was. And if you listen to some of my first ever podcasts, I launched a podcast about a month and a half before GDPR was enforced in 2018. I think it was like April of 18, and then in May the enforcement began. And I remember I had an episode where I really ripped into GDPR because I didn't feel like GDPR really gave privacy control to the citizen, because I feel like competition gives you privacy control, right?
Okay.
So I'm a firm believer in that aspect of capitalism. If you do something and your customers aren't happy with what you do, they're going to look for an alternative. An alternative is going to come up. You're going to have to either adjust or be out of business.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt like GDPR was kind of to make up for government budget shortfalls, using GDPR as kind of a way to kind of legally go and get these big companies, right, to pay their fair share, to help cover budget shortfalls within the EU. Mm-hmm. And after I released that episode, I had people that reached out to me and said, you kind of nailed it on the head. I have other that said, just typical opinion, and you're so off base, and it's about privacy. But I always revert people to Germany, and I go, Germany's always had a privacy bill. Germans are very, very private people.
They're focused on it. Yep.
They've had tighter laws than GDPR. I felt like GDPR wasn't. I think most Germans look at GDPR and go, we could have done it better. But no company in Germany was really like if a German client called and said, delete my data, there wasn't one company in Germany that would say no. Because there were, even before GDPR.
Yeah, it was mandatory. They had to.
Right.
And it was regulated, yeah.
Right. So I'm a firm believer that we don't necessarily, like, my idea of privacy is selling of information, which GDPR covers. Right? Like the trafficking of your information, mm-hmm. the trafficking of your data. I don't think we need to tell companies how to do that. I think if we reward companies and not fine them, because I feel like GDPR fines a victim.
That's always a good thing, being the positive side of security. How to enforce security, you do that through incentives. But punishment is a wrong.
But the current way we do it is not through incentives. Right now, what we say is, hey, you were a victim of a crime. Like, think of British Airways, right? Like, British Airways was a victim of a supply chain vendor, mm-hmm. that had bad security policies.
Yep. And they were still. Well, on the other hand, it was kind of their responsibility to make sure that their third parties defended.
Well, but let's be honest. So, if I need to audit my third party every month as a CISO, I will not have a security program, or I need to increase my budget tenfolds, right? Because I may not trust my third party vendor, and I may be like, okay, security audit, surprise audit. You can only audit someone once a year at best.
That's true. Okay, and it takes a lot of time. I agree, but that's where the risk appetite comes in. It's you as a CISO, or you as an organization, make choices where you want to invest that budget, because you by default you never have enough, right?
Right, but would you look at a live automated chatbot as being a potential attack vector, when at the time that happened for British Airways, that was not a trend? There were no TTPs really known about it. It wasn't something that people looked at and went, okay, our chatbot that our marketing department bought, where that company filled out the questionnaire, where really they are processing some client data, but all they are is APIing it into our booking system, right? Is that really a big deal?
So from a security perspective, from a security practitioner perspective, I agree. Looking at it, Facebook. Are you still here?
I am here. I can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, there you go. Okay, cool. So from a security perspective, security practitioner perspective, I get it. You are right. Like, you can look at it and you're like, okay, what's the value of that data? What's the technology behind it? Is it secured, etc.? But if you look at it from a legislation perspective, or from a legislator's perspective, or you look at it from just a responsibility to your customers, we might go one step further and say, okay, yes, if is such an important part of our business, and maybe British Airways in this case should have made a different decision and put some more money. Look, BA is a big company, a lot of money, a lot of.
How many airlines have gone under this year?
A lot, but that's not. Let's face it. This was before the whole Corona.
It makes no difference. They operate on slim margins. They may make a lot of money, but that's volume based. That's not. That's not a. I know a lot of people in the airline industry. So I mean, there's an aspect to that where it's a low margin game.
Yeah, but does that give them the right not to do security properly, or not?
So if you
should security measures be equivalent or linked to your income?
So what are you more worried about if you're a CISO of an airline? The chat bot that's on your website that may be doing 1,000 bookings a month, right? Or your aircraft operating systems, your communication with air traffic control, right? And your IT or OT system that could cause a loss of life. So when you talk about risk appetite, in the case of and I'm talking purely on the British Airways thing, I was very much against it. I felt like they were re-victimizing a victim. I believe, one of the things I want to push for in the US is a reward-based cybersecurity incentive rather than a fine-based cybersecurity approach, because unless there's something called gross negligence. What is gross negligence? I do no security. I don't put passwords on my databases. I expose everything. I don't really have, set a framework. NIST, CIS Top 20. I don't care. Pick a framework.
Go ahead. Yep.
And make that framework the standard. And say if every company follows this framework, they cannot be held liable for a data breach unless there's gross negligence.
So there's an issue already, because you want to have do you want to have a global standard? And do you think that would work? Because if you pick either NIST, or we have our ENISA, which is part of the European version of that, do you think we can make something like that global?
No,
because
cyber is not cyber regulation can never be global. I've heard people talk about like a cyber bill of rights or a cyber kind of UN, and I laugh at that because no country's ever going to sign a doctrine.
No, I agree. No, that's not going to happen. Even with the ridiculous amounts of money we spend over here in Europe, like I think we have a really cool incentive called Horizon Europe. I think it's 100 billion or something for 6 years period. A lot of money purely for cybersecurity. Probably what will happen if we have a global framework, a global standard, is that people will start pointing at each other like, okay, but we spent 100 billion, you only spent 20 billion. That's not fair.
Well, we see that with NATO spending on defense, right? Every country that's part of NATO is supposed to contribute 2% of their GDP to the NATO Defense Fund. And
it ain't happening.
Well, it's starting now. I mean, in the last 3 years, more countries have picked up their share, thanks to one crazy big orange man. But yeah.
Let's see what happens after COVID, if those countries can still afford their NATO spending. Because I think with everything that's going on in the world now,
we live in a safe. But time out. We live in a safer world.
You think so?
So, unbeknownst to the fact that there's been 2 terror attacks in France in the last week, right? The beheading last week, and then as you and I speak, we're recording on Thursday morning. Right before we sat down, I saw that there was a terror attack in Nice, where some guy stabbed some people in Nice, and was shot and eliminated by the French police. So outside of that, right, which outside of that, we live in a safer world today, and I'll explain. We live in a safer world today for a multitude of reasons. One, our intelligence agencies and technology has made it very easy to identify threats before they even happen and deflect those threats quicker. So the lone wolf attacks are always hard to stop. They're very difficult to do that. So from a personal security perspective of walking down the street, of going somewhere, we're safer. The I don't want to say the global economy, but I want to say global air travel, the affordability of travel and being able to explore the world has also bridged gaps between people who may have had prejudice towards another set of people. So it's bridged. So we no longer fall into the political narrative that politicians want to give us. And by the way, in case people have been missing the news, there's actually peace in the Middle East. Like Israel now has the fifth peace deal is being announced today. They have UAE, Bahrain, Sudan. Right now, Morocco and Oman are coming on board over the next 2 to 3 weeks. So we have peace in the Middle East.
That's first. But
do
you also think you're talking about physical security now?
Well, because I think you have to look strategically at these peace deals and what they really mean. Beyond physical security, they also mean a greater cyber alliance. So while these nations that are now understanding the cyber technological capabilities to stop wide-scale, massive physical attacks, they're also now able to track and create kind of a joint governmental kind of like Interpol version of cyber threats that can disable a WannaCry and not Petya.
Wow. Personally, I don't see that happening yet. There might be incentives to do that. They might want to do it. But between nation states having an intention to do something and actually doing it, you really think that we do have a safer cyber world today?
Do we have a safer cyber world today? I think wherever there's a profit, you're going to see more people go into that. Okay. Right now, cybersecurity is profitable. I think if more nations passed a bill, like the U.S., like the Department of Justice did in the U.S. this month, where they said anyone who pays a ransomware, any one of these ransomware can be held liable for funding terror and violating DOJ. And so now what that's made organizations do, and I've seen the scramble over the last 30 days since that directive came out of the DOJ, is and insurance companies are having to rethink this, is now they're saying, okay, so if we can't pay a ransomware, where do we invest the money? Right? And then how do we start to do that? Because a lot of insurance companies were paying the ransom, and that's why so many people got into ransomware. Right? It's like
there was money to be made.
There's money to be made. So I think the US here, and I'll support your European colleagues in saying that the US here is leading the way. I think if Europe and the rest of the world adopted if your organization pays a ransom to a ransomware attack, then you could be charged with funding terror. That would, by the way, get the board to allocate more money to go, okay, so how do ransomware attacks happen?
Yeah, and how
where do we need to invest? Yeah. Right, how do we invest more money? Okay, so that's where awareness comes through, right? Like what you guys do at KnowBe4 and so forth.
Yeah, so I personally, my personal opinion is don't pay. But I also understand when a board of a company goes like, okay, so we don't pay, that's our intention, but look, the whole organization, we're down. We can't produce, we can't do anything. We've got contracts with partners, we can't fulfill. It's just operational madness. I can also understand that if we as a security industry, because what happens if a ransomware attack occurs, they usually turn to a cybersecurity expert to help them out. We need to make sure that we are able to help those organizations that do fall victim to ransomware more quickly and efficiently, so that we can provide an inkling of how are we going to fix this? When is it going to be fixed? What can you expect as a customer? And we need to build technologies to do that, because now it's very hard to do. If a ransomware is successful, if it's a really well done ransomware attack, it's really hard to get a company up and running again, especially if it's a larger company like the Maersk or Maersk incident. That's a big company to get up and running.
But they fell on a global ransomware pandemic, right? I mean,
does that really matter whether it's a global pandemic or a local one? So they're still down.
Well, I mean, when it's a domino, ransomware attack, right? And we all know how WannaCry's been covered. It's kind of like a wildfire, right?
Yeah.
A lighter was lit one place and then it started lighting the rest, and it moved with the wind, right? It moved with the sun.
Yeah, which fire they go. Yep.
That's not the case. I personally think one thing, and one thing I almost am jealous of, like that I see in Israel and I see in other parts of Europe, is the collaboration between private enterprise and government, which in the US we're just starting to pick up on. Like, I'd almost be for companies paying a stipend, a small tax to create a national cyber task force, like a national CERT, that is on top of your incident response team, right? That's integrated. Like, every state in the US can have one, which is kind of like their state CERT team. And they deploy to help organizations that are impacted by these ransomware attacks to recover. And they set out policies. They set out like how to stop it, the TTPs. They create like, I think that would be far more effective than maybe per se anything else.
So we have something called the NCC, right?
Right.
National Cybersecurity Center, and it's their job to help organizations to increase their cyber resilience. And it's their job to make sure that organizations are aware of what can happen. Now, if you're an organization and you fall victim to a ransomware attack, and it's madness, it's chaotic within your organization. Nobody can work, nobody can do anything. Sure, you're going to call the NCSC, you're going to call the police, cybercrime units, but in the end, the only thing you as a board want is get up and running again as quickly as possible. And cyber criminals make it very easy for an organization to pay that ransom. Just get some Bitcoin, send it along, hey, you're done. Here's the decryptors and you have fun with it. As long as we can't help organizations get up and running more quickly than the cyber criminals can, well, I think organizations will still tend to pay, because it's the quickest way for them to salvation, however you want to call it. And I think that's an issue when you look at it from the legislation perspective. You might be doing something against the law if you pay as an organization. That doesn't mean that, and you might get fined for that. I would suggest doing something you proposed earlier. Give them a reward for good behavior. So not paying, helping everyone out, make sure they get a tax cut or whatever. Something that's a positive end to that, a positive approach to that.
So, my idea of a positive approach is no tax cuts. I'm kind of in the idea of, and again, I'm not for taxation. As I think this country's always had a history of, the people of this country is like, no tax. We broke up with the Brits because of that.
That's true. Yeah.
So I'm actually all for kind of changing the legislative mindset around cyber attacks, because the difference between businessmen and politicians is what businessmen see as a risk, the politician sees as an opportunity to add more money, right? And so the politician looks at that and goes, cyber, these companies bad. And you're like, really? Are they? Like, do you see a company out there going like, we want to be breached, ransomware attack us? No one wants it. And companies invest and spend a lot of time and money in trying to make sure that doesn't happen. Again, I go to the idea of create some sort of cybersecurity standard, support that, I think in the US, and I speak for the US, and I think the EU should do the same, by the way, right? Support that by having a statewide or a nationwide task force, a CERT, Kind of like how Israel does it. Israel has a 911 for cyber. If I'm a small accounting firm or law firm and I get breached and I'm in a ransomware attack, I call that number and they'll either send a team or they'll remotely log in and they'll try to help me kind of thwart the attack until I can get they're kind of like the ambulance, right? So they come in, they try to bandage you up, try to get you back online, or try to at least ensure that the attack doesn't expand beyond, let's say, 1 device, 2 devices within your network.
Keep it under control.
Right.
You're still under attack, but yeah.
And then you call in, one of the vendors that does incident response, and they come and they help you kind of the rest of the way. I think if we did that, we'd have more success because, and I'll explain, if you set a cyber standard, right, like a NIST or a CIS Top 20, any standard, and you're telling organizations, if you process any of this data, you got to comply and be within the compliance of this framework. And every year you have to do an audit and you have to post it on a security page of your website that shows the results of your audit, right? And that you're in compliance with that. One that would get you, and the audit isn't a SOC 2. Does that make sense? Like, it's not just it doesn't need to give you so much detail because no one needs to know your posture, but it does say you check the marks, you have all the right controls in place. It's more of a control thing than a posture thing.
A quality stamp, basically. Yeah.
Right. And then you take that and you kind of, I know people are going to probably comment and say, well, what about ISO 27001 or NIST? And I go, all of those are great. I don't care. Pick one. But instead of punishing companies for a breach, set a standard. Punish them if they don't comply with the standard. So if they don't comply with the standard and they get breached, that's when, yes, they should be held financially responsible for that because that's negligence, right? It's like driving drunk. If you drive drunk and you crash, you're negligent, right? We take away your driver's license. So we should do the same with cyber as well, kind of taking that aspect and have a national team that can help the businesses in the initial triage of an attack.
It would be really cool if we had that. I know that if you look at cybercrime units within the police or within the FBI in the US, I think they try to do that. I'm not sure.
Right, but they're understaffed and under budgeted.
Under budget, and as long as you don't pay your people more money, they're always going to go for a commercial vendor because that pays more. Simple as that. There's one aspect though that I'd like to add to what you just said. Not only do you triage with the incident response, you also have to help them actually understand how they can comply. Because I feel that a lot of organizations simply don't understand what's needed to comply, what's needed to be secure. A lot of organizations don't understand where what their threat posture actually is, what areas within their business are at risk, and how can we protect that. And large organizations, enterprise organizations, have a far better position in that than small businesses. But if you look at, especially in Europe, 90% or something of all businesses are small businesses, are mom and dad businesses. They have no idea. They don't have a CISO. Some of them don't have any IT of their own. They have no idea how to do that. So to your idea, I would just like to help those businesses with practical ideas on how you can actually be more secure, how you can actually do cybersecurity properly. And if you combine all those, we should be living in a better world after that, a safer world at least.
So I personally think that Netflix should pick up Insider Man and put it on Netflix. I think
that series is pretty cool. That's true.
I think if you did that, you might have a little bit more awareness. You'd have more people caring a little bit, and it's delivered in a way. You know what made people care about politics in the U.S.? People don't know this, but it's very interesting. I did a geopolitical study, and what made politics so polarizing, like what we do today?
Tell me.
Entertainment. So what happened is they started making TV shows about the White House, right? Think of The West Wing, think of House of Cards, all these different shows, Madam Secretary. It became kind of a thing, and people loved those shows because it kind of gave them almost a scripted insight into being a politician.
The inner workings of,
yeah, kind of like a Hollywood version of a working of, whether true or untrue.
Well, entertainment doesn't need to be true; it needs to be entertaining, most and foremost.
You would hope so. But that increased awareness. That increased that increased a lot of people paying attention, asking different questions, and it helped. And I think cyber should do the same, because right now cyber is a guy in a hoodie on a keyboard with a bunch of screens in front of him going enter, and you're like, that's not cyber. That's not at all what cyber is.
Nah, well, yes, Inside Man. The number one thing I hear back from people that watch that is it's entertaining. It really is. I think when we thought of that show and the scripts and everything, we did a brilliant job of almost disguising security awareness training into a TV show. Because yes, it's very entertaining, and yes, you want to see all of the next episodes and see the whole series, and but you still actually learn something. And I would agree that if doesn't have to be Netflix, but if organizations or governments take that approach to security awareness training, it would be more successful. The downside is it's not easy to do. It's hard to make a show like that. There's a lot of work and expertise that goes into that. So I don't know if they're capable of doing that.
Yeah. I mean, we've spoken about a whole bunch of things, and we're almost out of time. And I want to briefly summarize it. Then I kind of want to ask you one final thing here before we sign off, which is, when you look at the EU and the US, and you look at like different laws or approach or perspective. That's why I told you I don't think we're that different, right? Because what you think we do well, and we're so far ahead of Europe, we look at you guys and we go, they're doing it so much better than us. Right. And that's why I think that the gap in cyber is communication.
That's a good one. I agree. Well, actually, communication and cooperation.
Yeah.
These two together. And that we need to do that more. That's why, there's a big ocean in between. As I said, boundaries. There's no boundaries in the digital realm. There shouldn't be any. So it doesn't matter whether you're from the US or whether you're from Europe or from Asia. We should all just work together, basically, to make this world a safer place. That's if you want to look at it from a higher perspective. But
you tulip-smelling Dutch guy, Yeah. We would all like to make the world a safer place. I think the challenge we have is that not everyone wants to play by the same set of rules. And the word safe means something different for you than it does to me, than it does to someone else.
That's definitely true. So let's talk about what's safe first.
Yeah, let's define that. Jelle, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Guys, Jelle with no before. I'd say his last name. I'd absolutely and totally butcher it. So you guys see it in the description. It's there. Thanks so much for tuning into this week's Tech Corner. On Sunday, we kick off our Veteran November initiative. Every day, Sunday through Friday, I'll be airing at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on top of all of our other content. An interview with a U.S., British, or other military veteran of their transition from the military to InfoSec and kind of highlighting their service. So I hope you enjoyed that special series for Veteran November, an initiative here at the podcast. That's it. Have a great weekend, folks. Sunday, we kick off our Veteran November series. So I'm very, very excited for you guys to hear that. Our first guest will be Patrick Benoit, the BISA over at CBRE. Until then, folks, have a great weekend. Shabbat Shalom. Enjoy your free time. Smell some tulips, go out, ride a bike, hike, do something with yourself. Turn off your phones and notifications. It's the weekend before the election, but I promise you we're going to be okay on Wednesday morning. I promise that. I know that much. That's it. James Hazel here signing off, folks. Stay cyber safe.
Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. And get all the latest information at cyberhubpodcast.com.